Welcome, everybody. We've been asked to think about creativity and ritual. And when we started talking about this together and thinking about what that might entail, it's quite a broad topic. We realised that there are really two very different approaches to this. There's thinking about being creative with our existing rituals, whether that's our Shabbat or festival services or other Jewish rituals, and how we are creative with them and how far we can go with that and what that looks like and all of that. And then there's the idea of creating new rituals, of being creative by bringing creativity to ritual, by thinking about the rituals that are missing in Jewish tradition. But we're going to try and just scratch the surface of both of them in the hope that it will get people thinking and they might want to go away and learn more. So in the first half of this session, I am going to look at how we bring creativity to our existing Jewish rituals, our liturgy, our services, our festival celebrations, etc. And really think about three issues around that, or three motivations, I suppose, as to why we might want to bring creativity. Why not just leave it as it is? The first of those is thinking about relevance, how we want what we want to do to make our Jewish practices as relevant as possible. The second one is about engagement and making things appealing and engaging people and making them want to be involved. Another motivating factor behind creativity. And the third one is around practicalities. And it might sound a bit mundane to talk about practicalities when we're talking about creativity, which sounds so exciting. But actually, all of our communities have different parameters, different spaces, different types of people in terms of their level of Jewish practice or whether they're willing to take the day off for a festival, etc. And sometimes our creativity is as simple as thinking creatively about when we do things or how we do things in order to engage with the practicalities of people's lives. In the second half, Rabbi Miriam is going to be looking at the creativity of the creation of new rituals and focusing on three completely different motivations or issues that are sort of driving that. One is personalization, how we make things personal for people. One is to do with how we incorporate ideas of wellness and well-being into Jewish practice and Jewish ritual. And then the last piece there is to do with innovation around rituals we think about when our tradition was crystallized, rituals for things that are part of our life these days that weren't part of the, people's lives then. So in this first half, let's get started with this first half, thinking about how we are creative, in what ways and within what parameters we are creative with our existing rituals and liturgy. We're going to start with just services, bringing creativity into our Shabbat and festival services. So engaging children and older generations, so engaging people on the peripheries, music. Interesting, only rabbis can influence the structure of a service. Meaningful and beautiful ritual objects. As someone on the path to conversion, I found it very encouraging that English is used quite a bit. Interesting. Things that we find quite normal in our services, the use of English or other things, they were creative innovations once. Creativity has been going on for a long time, and something starts as creative or innovative or cutting edge or shocking, and then it becomes acceptable. Thought-provoking, including people to take part in the service. Poetry, great. So these are ideas of things we can include to make things more creative. So poetry, a community-led service, lovely. Interesting and additional readings, interesting readings that make you think, brilliant. Again, quite a typical part of our progressive liturgy these days, but definitely a creative addition to traditional liturgy. Linking Torah portion to local matters and having an alternative haftarah, fantastic. So rather than having a haftarah from the prophets, having a haftarah from anywhere in Jewish literature or beyond. Being open to different interpretations of teachings, dialogue. Dialogue, interesting. Dialogue in services, discussion, panels with experts, different seating. Yes, creativity around the space, how we use the space, how we interact with the space, bringing different shuls, bringing different synagogues and communities together, personalize. The leader relates interesting events, local events, family. At Menorah, we have regular community-led services, taking a social model of disability approach to understanding disabled Jews' experiences. So I'm thinking that's around inclusivity and how we can be creative in our thinking around what makes services more inclusive. Multi-denominational services, love it. Getting congregants to read different parts of the service, so participation. We had poetry, any other kind of wild and wacky ideas that you've seen done in a service, or you've always wanted to see done in a service, or you would hate the thought of being done in a service. Torah bingo for the kids. Oh my goodness. That idea I love. That's got my creative juices going immediately. Torah bingo. Um, Children's involvement. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, brilliant. So we're at starting point. A circus performance. Ask Rabbi Miri from Ealing. Yes, or come to the Southwest Hagigah in October, where Rabbi Miri will be talking about her circus life and doing a workshop. Looking at Jewish rituals from other countries, such as Mimuna, lovely. New music, songs, words, sharing with other congregations, and of course, poetry, singing, and yeah, karaoke in a service. Oh my goodness. Rediscovering old rituals and adapting to contemporary life. The liturgy, so use of technology, the liturgy projected onto walls either side of the ark, which is beautifully done at the LJS. Okay. Fabulous. I'm going to dressing up. Oh, yeah. The 1930s service where they all dressed up. Meditation. Brilliant. Here's just a few ideas that I've put out there. So, readings, space, how we use the space, drumming, poetry, yoga, movement, connection. I'm thinking about connecting people in discussion, explanatory services where you learn about the liturgy as you go along. Music, different music, innovative music, music from the musicals, gospel music, singing and dance, and meditation and sensory services, chanting, taking our services into different spaces like outdoors or on the beach, involving nature and spirituality. And collective art. I think collective art is something that we use quite a lot in our community for the festivals, for services where we're particularly encouraging families to come along, where we might ask people to make or write something very small and then add it to a piece of collective art that represents that sort of process in an individual and collective way. So I said we're going to talk about three different issues when it comes to thinking about creativity in our services and in our rituals. Progressive Judaism has always been concerned with making our rituals and our liturgy relevant and has always been creative with that. And it might not feel like creativity today because it's become the status quo, but having our services partly in English, sometimes all in English, using alternative translations, changing the liturgy to be more egalitarian and more inclusive, adding the imahot, the foremothers, into the prayers, using more gender neutral terminology around God and people. All of this were creative innovations and were cutting edge creative innovations in their time. Thinking about theology, we share so much as these two movements merging together, but we have two very different prayer books, and they are both creative in very different ways. They contain lots of additional readings, poetry and prose and essays and meditations and reflections, and all of this is about making our prayer book a relevant document for us to pick up. It feels like liturgy and ritual for our times, not liturgy and ritual for olden times, 2000 years ago. Then we're thinking about appeal and engagement, and a lot of the bits that were written in the chat were around engaging younger people, including children, making it fun, making it engaging for the younger generation. And I would say that it applies not just to children, it applies to everybody. But yeah, definitely as times change and tastes change and the styles that appeal to people change, and even the vocabulary we use changes, we have to adapt to that. And a younger generation are not necessarily going to appreciate 19th century vocabulary or 20th century, early 20th century musical taste. And there's a degree of wanting to preserve and respect and honor our tradition. But if we're pragmatic and we want to make sure we engage the next generation and that they're engaged enough to want to engage the next generation and the next generation, who will definitely find this our style out of date, then we have to be prepared to be creative with the musical styles that we're bringing in, the style of doing things that we're bringing in, whether it's around bringing in alternative practices, for example, bringing in some movement, some yoga, some poetry, some meditation, some silence, bringing in all of these things in order to engage people, in order to increase the appeal of our rituals and our liturgy. Because if we don't, we might well just lose the next generation, and then there won't be a next generation to worry about, a generation after that to worry about. And finally, we talked about practicalities, and practicalities feel like restrictions, so my community does not have a building. We have to hire a space. The space is not always perfect for us, not always convenient, and it feels like a restriction. The fact that in some of our communities, people are not interested in and not willing to take time off for the Chagim is a restriction, is a practical restriction. The fact that less and less people necessarily have the sort of the skills, the knowledge, the Hebrew level to engage in a certain style of service is a restriction. But it can also be an opportunity for creative thinking. It's not necessarily creativity in the sense of, let's be creative, let's do some beautiful art or dance, but it's creative thinking that leads us to think outside the box, that leads us to work with those restrictions and those realities and those practicalities, to think differently and potentially to come up with something that we wouldn't have necessarily wanted to come up with in the first place, but ends up being something fantastic that revolutionizes how we do things, that appeals not only to the people for whom it's convenient, but to the people who didn't want it in the first place because they were quite happy with how things were. So I feel like these are the sort of the three things that are the driving forces behind our desire to be creative and not just leave things how they are. But also, if we're doing something different, if we're saying everybody get up and move, not everybody can get up and move. So a sensitivity there. Thank you for raising that. It's really, really important. These are our driving forces that make us want to be creative. But then I want to think about the limitations. The question really, how far is too far? Does anything go? At what point does it cease to be a Jewish ritual? At what point does a Shabbat service cease to be a Shabbat service because our creativity has overstepped a line? What is that line? Is there a line? This is a big conversation we have to have when we're thinking about creativity. And my approach to it, and there are definitely many different approaches to it, but my approach to it is to think about the overarching structure, an overarching journey that you take people on in any given synagogue service or Jewish ritual. And that if you're conscious of that journey and that arc, and then you can be creative within that structure, and it will still be what it always was, if that makes sense. So I'm going to use an example of just a standard Shabbat morning service. So this is a sort of a diagram called the prayer mountain. And it uses the idea that a synagogue service follows a standard arc. It starts off with a kind of a gentle incline, and then it has some sort of little high moments and full summits along the way. It gets steeper and steeper until you get to the summit, the Torah reading, and then it has a much more rapid descent down the other side. You can see on the screen, you've got the foothills, you've got the base camp where the foothills where you're warming up and getting ready. Base camp is where you make sure that you kind of weed out the people that are not ready for the climb, the Berger. Are you ready? Are you ready to pray? Then you go up the main climb. You have this high moment in the Amidah, the full summit. Not false because it's bad, but because it's a high moment that you come down from. And then you carry on up an even steeper summit to the Torah reading and descend obviously through the Aleinu, the Kaddish, the concluding benedictions, down a lump. I actually have a different version of this diagram. I should have brought it, which has a little little flick up at the end, because we always end on something fun and upbeat. So we don't kind of go down to the bottom. We kind of have a little flick up at the end. But if we think about this structure and we say, well, this is the basic structure this is the journey we're trying to take people on when we are creating a Shabbat service, we can do that using the liturgy, the Pesukah de Zimra, the Shema, the Amidah. We can do that using the liturgy. But could we also do that? Could we be as creative as we want to be, but restrict ourselves to the confines of this journey, of this pattern, of the kind of gentle introduction, something that allows people to check in, something really profound and a sort of a big moment, then something even more transcendent, and then a kind of a rapid decline. If we did that, would it still feel like a synagogue service? If the whole thing was done through guided meditation, but it still followed these patterns and these themes? If the whole thing was done as an outdoor walking service, but it still followed these patterns and these themes, and you felt like you were going on the same journey, would it still be a synagogue service? If you're walking in the woods, engaging in different activities, maybe readings, maybe reflection and meditation, but following this pattern. And if you didn't follow this pattern, and you just went on a generic spiritual walk in the woods, is that too far? Would that still feel like a synagogue or Shabbat morning service, let's say? I was going to think about afternoon service on Yom Kippur. So you're part of the committee. You're thinking about how are we going to make Yom Kippur interesting and engaging and dynamic and diverse this year, and it has been decided that the afternoon service is going to be an alternative service because we've already done the morning service and the Musaf service. We can afford to do something different for the afternoon service. So the first thing is, what is the purpose of this service? What is the purpose of a Yom Kippur afternoon service? What are we broadly trying to achieve? So it's a continuation of the day. So, Yom Kippur liturgy lasts the whole day. So it's a continuation of the day and the purpose of the day, which is atonement and reflection. Somebody said the purpose is rest, that actually by that point in the day, everybody is tired and hungry and struggling a bit, and actually it needs to be a bit more chilled than the morning. Personal, communal reflection and atonement, to have an afternoon service, reflection, a reminder of our heritage, deep personal reflection and intention setting. It's getting towards the end of the day. The book of Jonah, remembering, so that's year's course, we're focusing on the afternoon, to take stock of what's been happening during the rest of the day as you go into that end part, definitely. Potentially to go off at a tangent, but a relevant tangent. Okay, so great. So we've thought about what is the core purpose of this. Then we want to think about what are the limitations and expectations. So if we don't read the book of Jonah, is in our community, is that going to upset people? If we don't follow a normal structure of a service, is that going to upset? What are the limitations and expectations? I will let you think about those yourself because they'll be very different in each community. And let's use the chat now to think about creative ideas of what we could do with that service slot that would still achieve the same goals, that would still take people on the same journey as an afternoon service, but in a creative, alternative way. Let the community lead the service instead of the rabbi. Yeah, absolutely. Like, first of all, give the rabbi a rest, but also like shake things up, different voices. You want to break from the monotony of Yom Kippur in some ways. An opportunity for a study session, absolutely. To do some learning, interactive learning rather than just repetition. A modern Jonah, it could be a play, it could be a rewriting of the story, discussion, absolutely. Learn commentaries on Jonah, yeah, a study session, learning. So there's so many different spaces, and this is an easy one in some ways. We feel like Yom Kippur afternoon is easy to be creative with because we feel like we've done Yom Kippur in the morning, and so we're free to be creative with it. If I had said, how do we turn our Shavuot morning service or our Erev Rosh Hashanah service into something creative, it might have sat less comfortably with us. But the same principle applies, which is as long as we've got the idea of what we're trying to achieve, we've got the idea of what the parameters are and the restrictions, we can be creative within those restrictions and still achieve the same goal. I've got 1 minute to tell you about an afternoon Yom Kippur service that we did as an example of a solution to this. So it was very alternative. It was a meditation space with mandala activities, mandala coloring activities, and mandala making with little pieces of rice and lentils activities to be done in silence in a meditation space with a soundscape. I'm calling it a soundscape. It was just a playlist with a soundscape that lasted for an hour. That was a combination of music, classical music, Jewish music, some liturgical music, spoken word, podcasts, sermons, etc., from various different people, structured in the arc of a service. So people could sit in that space, be busy with their hands, be meditative, and just listen to this kind of all-encompassing soundscape of music and words around them. And I'm not going to pretend that everybody loved it, but quite a few people who thought they were going to hate it quite liked it.
I went with a very open mind at our synagogue about a 1 hour, which I thought was really interesting, about a Tai, can you hear me? A Tai
Chi session.
Tai Chi session, yeah.
And I'll be honest, whilst that would have been absolutely brilliant in the gym, but I think one thing I learned from that through a creative session was it didn't link to anything about Judaism, about I go into a Shabbat service because I want something that feels that's relevant.
It's a great example,
Jewish.
Simone.
Yeah. I've got a criticism.
It's a great example.
It's a great
I
example.
just thought there was something in there that involved maybe some discussion about Torah. Oh, I can see, yeah. So that was a really good example.
Brilliant.
Okay.
It's a great example because, first of all, it didn't work for you, and not everything's going to work for everybody, and that's fine. But also, somebody could have used Tai Chi in a way that did incorporate Jewish traditions and did follow the arc, and it would have been a very different experience. It wouldn't have felt just like doing Tai Chi. So brilliant. That's exactly perfect. Thank you, because that's exactly what I was getting at. That the balance between freedom and creativity and keeping ourselves within some degree of Jewish structure can really achieve something beautiful. And when we go beyond that, it can become quite just disconnected. Thank you. Miriam, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Simone, for helping us make that transition. So Anna and I are in really different settings at the moment in terms of where our rabbinate has taken us. And it's why when we were given this title of what it was that we were going to be teaching about this evening, we really took on two very different focuses. And Anna's focus was very much within the community setting, and how do you enable a community of people to be creative? And mine very much focuses within what does it mean at this moment to be creating ritual? What does the word ritual mean to you? If you had to give nothing more than a brief dictionary definition of the word ritual, how would you define the word ritual?
For me, a ritual is something repetitive, what I find comfort in.
You're basing on something repetitive becomes a ritual, and ritual becomes comforting for you. Brilliant. So repetition and comfort.
Traditional.
Cool. So something traditional. So for you, there's something synonymous between ritual and tradition. Okay, great. Anybody else?
Yeah. Anybody going to a different shul will feel won't feel they're in some strange place. In other words, it's common to every synagogue in the world.
Nice. So the idea for you, the concept that ritual binds us either with something from the past or something with other people that are following the same traditions. And maybe it's that's repetitive. Maybe it's that gives us the comfort, but it's that enables it to feel like ritual. The dictionary talks about a religious or solemn ceremony. And I would say that actually not all ritual is a solemn ceremony, but actually that it's something that elevates or gives meaning to an action or a series of actions or a particular time, that it's in some way elevating. So for instance, we can light a scented candle in our living room, and we have simply lit a candle, right? And you might be somebody that lights scented candles really regularly in your home because you like the smell of them, or because that smell is comforting or calming or sets some kind of tone in your room. For me, that's not a ritual, but you're doing the exact same act when you're lighting the Shabbat candles. So what makes lighting Shabbat candles a ritual, but lighting your scented candle not a ritual? For me, it's because in some way, the moment that you're lighting candles, the intention behind the act is something about creating or elevating the moment that you're in and bringing meaning to that action. So sometimes it's actually the kavanah, the intention behind the act. Sometimes it's about the tradition of the act and what its intention is, but there's something around elevating the moment or the meaning behind what you're doing. And I suspect it's this that is really why my rabbinate has taken a somewhat different trajectory than I could possibly have imagined when I started at Finchley Reformed Synagogue 19 years ago and served my 18 years at FRS. There was certainly no intention that my rabbinate would become about creating personal moments of ritual for people, and particularly ones around mikveh. Because, I mean, I can assure you 18 years ago, mikveh was really not my thing at all. But you can, if you're interested in that stuff, you can find me at wellspringuk.org, which is this new organization that I'm setting up cross-denominationally there as a real resource to progressive Judaism. Now, if we think of these ideas of ritual that you've just kind of given us examples of what it means to you, I would say that in our much more secular society that we're finding ourselves amid, that because people have not got religious practice in their lives so much, that they're creating ritual where ritual didn't exist so much in our time, okay? Does anyone remember their last day at school, or any kind of ritual around graduating school? I'm not talking about university and graduations, but I would wonder whether anybody on this call had a prom, or any kind of event that involved a very specific type of dress that you can even find online as a prom dress, let alone a whole series of kind of rituals and rules around attending that prom or that dance, about who you go with, what you wear, how you get there. They simply didn't exist in our time. But all of a sudden, it's becoming very mainstream and absolutely part of how our 16 or 18-year-olds are finishing school. Or what about Halloween, right? When I was a kid, I wasn't allowed to go trick-or-treating because I was part of the rabbi's family, but I totally didn't feel like I was missing out. Nobody was trick-or-treating. But as the years have gone on, not just trick or treating, there's a whole ritual around Halloween, around decorating houses. Those of you who are not into Christian practices around Christmas, although I'd be shot online for suggesting that Christmas had anything to do with being Christian, because the vast majority of the population who want the exact rules of how to play Elf on the Shelf, a small toy that seems to have a whole Talmudic like explanation of how you move this thing around your house each night to amuse your children, so that they do funny or naughty things each day in the lead up to Christmas. People are asking online each year for the rules. How do we do it? Should I do it like this? Should I do it like that? What's the exact way of doing it? To me, it's fascinating, because the more you take ritual from religion out of people's lives, the more they're looking for it and inventing it. And the sad piece is that it doesn't really come with any values or tradition behind it. It doesn't link you to anything bigger than our lives or more profound. It just gives people, and I'm not diminishing the importance of family time or homemade rituals, but actually it's really sad that what we're seeing in society at the moment is if you take out enough ritual, people will find ways of putting it in, even though it isn't giving them anything kind of more important or higher in their lives. So I see us having an absolute obligation to make our Jewish rituals speak for people's lives today. And I think that our rabbis have always seen that as their obligation. Okay, they completely understood it, because they invented bar mitzvah, right? Now, I know that we'd all like to think that children and boys have been being called to Torah, to read Torah, on marking their 13th birthday since Moses went up Mount Sinai. But actually, it's not it's only in the Middle Ages that that became a thing. Only in the 16th century that being called to Torah became synonymous with this idea of becoming bar mitzvah. Only in the 17th century that people decided actually you needed to give boys some kind of preparation to becoming bar mitzvah, so they should start laying tefillin a few months before. And let alone calling girls up and the evolution of making our b'nai mitzvah totally egalitarian and treating our kids all the same. Just as our Judaism has always evolved to today, so we need to continue to evolving Judaism. And why? I would say because ritual needs to speak for 3 different times in our lives. It needs to speak to our own well-being. And the rabbis may not have experienced the need for ritual in our well-being because they thought that's what they were doing, but perhaps our well-being has incorporated many things that they didn't know. So can you think of a moment in your life to do with your health that actually there could have been some kind of ritual around? Anybody counted anything in their lives? Anybody doing anything particular around their health or well-being that actually we needed some kind of ritual towards? Dry January is a great example. Someone said to me the other day that they didn't know how to mark their 40th dose of chemotherapy, that they felt they'd really reached a milestone, their 40th dose of chemotherapy. Like, how do you mark that? The rabbis didn't have language for that. They certainly didn't know how to deal with a major medical diagnoses because people didn't get terminal diagnoses, they just died. So how do we deal with those kind of well-being moments? Jack, thank you. I'm glad you found the right prayers in forms of prayer. There are definitely some more innovative prayers, later prayers that have been added for significant illness and before surgery. And that sense of marking the loss of independence is a great example of what does it mean to be able to mark that moment of how do I hold this? How do I own this for myself? There's something also around personalization, that not all ritual needs to be for absolutely everybody, right? So for instance, we have naming ceremonies for babies when they're born, but what about for people who, for whatever reason, change their name or identify themselves in different ways later on in life? At what point do we say, actually, how do we welcome a new or a different you into community or into the world? How do we mark this moment of being seen or being spoken of or to differently? So maybe that naming or identity change to be able to personalize that moment for themselves, and events that the rabbis simply wouldn't have known about. So retirement or taking a loved one and having to take them to a care home because you can no longer care for them at your own home. These are all examples of needing to make moments of ritual, even if the rabbis didn't know 100 years ago that we would need to ritualize these moments because they didn't yet exist in community. Jenny, that rabbinic acknowledgement is a great one of being able to say one of the really important things of ritual is often being witnessed. So it's not that you're going through something in your own home, quietly challenged behind closed doors, but what does it mean for people, for your clergy or for your community or for friends and family to witness you in that moment? And creating ritual in order to witness is really important. A ritual for retirement of work, I think, is really a great one, particularly either when work has been just so defining in your day or in your week, but also when it holds so much of your identity, right? So many of our jobs are how other people relate to us. What happens when we suddenly step outside of those confines? How do we ritualize that moment for ourselves and for other people who are going to, at that moment, see us or respond to us perhaps differently?
I had a hemorrhagic stroke which cleared up almost instantly. And I went to shul when I came back from the hospital. I went to shul, and I got a get well card that Saturday. And when I went to shul, I opened the book for when they wish people well, when they have prayers for healing, and out dropped a gomel blessing because we don't have it in the Levka dust.
Okay. That you were able to bench gomel with your community is really an extraordinary way. We do a communal benching gomel on Rosh Hashanah at FRS. That way of being able to say as a community, who in this year has had a moment where they have felt actually their life or a part of who they are has been at risk. So Gomel is a blessing particularly associated with a moment where your life has been at risk, and when you have felt that you have been in some way saved. So one of the examples is historically a sailor who has returned from a difficult, stormy journey and was worried they might not return, that they have a blessing of being back within their community when they thought they might not make it. But certainly medically, or if you've been involved in an accident, there are ways of being able to use this very simple blessing. The significance of Gomel is that it's not just the blessing you say, it's the fact that your community respond to it as a repeat of that blessing. They answer your blessing. And actually, there's something about sometimes these moments, again, not just need witnessing, but need responding to, in that sense of we hear what you've experienced and we're so relieved that you're still with us and that you're here. Beautiful ancient rituals that can absolutely speak to a modern age and a modern moment. I would say to give meaning to our rituals, we probably do things in one of two ways. Either we take a ritual that exists and we give another layer of meaning to it. So for instance, lighting the Shabbat candles, many of us will do every Friday night. But what happens when you're marking time for some reason. Maybe somebody, your loved one, is not well and you're worried about how many weeks they've got. But you're lighting the Shabbat candles reminds you they've survived another week. Or maybe life is really hard as a carer and you're really exhausted, and that every Shabbat gives you the opportunity when you light the candles to say, we've both got through another week, that I've been sapped of my strength this week being a carer, and yet I'm so relieved and pleased that here we are celebrating another Shabbat together. So that extra layer that we use an existing ritual in our lives to already add meaning to. And the other is to say, here's a moment in my life. How do I take an existing Jewish ritual and make it speak to this moment? So Havdalah, for instance, the ceremony that ends Shabbat, is all about making a separation between one time and another. Okay. If you're coming out of a relationship, it might be that actually on receiving your decree nisi in a divorce, or when your partner moves out of home, making Havdalah is a way of being able to say, I'm separating this chapter of my life, this last chapter, from my next chapter. And I'm taking Havdalah, which might be on a Saturday night, but in this case, it might be at some other time, to use the rituals of the candle and light, and what's going to be my light in this new chapter, my spices of what's going to be what I'm taking from the chapter of the positive and continuing in my new chapter, and the wine of being able to say, actually, let me think of what's going to be truly joyous and pleasurable in the next chapter, not just what's going to be painful and difficult in the next chapter. So we're simply taking an existing ritual and enabling it to speak to a very personal moment. What does it mean to take our teenagers to university and to put a mezuzah up on their door, or to be able to say, like, this is a new home. What's this moment to you? Or even to take their mezuzah down from their bedroom at home and take it with them and maybe bring it back in the holidays, that sense of taking the ritual, the piece of them at home, and allowing it to speak to them back at university, so that they have that sense of a connection between home where they've been brought up and home where they're studying. And maybe that's the same if your loved one is going to a care home. What does it mean to be able to take that ritual of a mezuzah from home and replacing it on the door of their care home, or even a Havdalah ceremony so it's not just packing up their stuff into a suitcase, but actually, what does it mean to say this is not the ending, it's just a chapter change and a new chapter. It's really hard to hear so many really challenging moments in your lives, but how wonderful to be able to say, actually, this could be a way of being able to say, what does it mean to add value, as Graham says, and to be able to make meaning. Absolutely. Even just remembering to say why we have a blessing before we eat, because it elevates something so mundane. And Yvonne, I'm going to say not just the Havdalah before your conversion, but definitely a mikveh afterwards, and to be able to say, what does it mean? Of what are you leaving in the water, and what are you taking out of the water with you? It's not about cleansing. It's not about being pure and impure, but rather that transition of one state of being into another. And what is it that we want from that transition, and what do we want to keep with us, and what do we want to leave with there? So I'm going to share with you the outline of a ceremony created by what I call in the mikveh world, Mayim Chayim, the mothership, which is a Boston-based mikveh who, under the guidance of Anita Diamond, who you might know from her book, The Red Tent. She created Mayim Chayim not just as a mikveh to be used in all its halachic senses of for ritual purity and nidah and conversion, but also to be able to have a very bodily, very physical opportunity to be able to mark different times. And they say, when you immerse, what we know from using the mikveh, for those that have not come across a mikveh, it is a pool of water, particularly designed with flowing, naturally collected water that allows us to be able to go from one state of being to another. And you immerse 3 times when you use the mikveh. And so a lot of the construct around mikveh ceremonies is doing exactly this. So 3 immersions. We begin with what the immersee, the person going into the water, is moving past or moving on from. What's the chapter that's closing? Accepting the present. What is it that they're coping with that is, this is my life now? It might be positive, it might be negative, but it's about saying, this is how it is, even if it's not how I'd like it to be, and ends with hopes for the future. So what would we hope the next chapter might look like? What are we taking out of the mikveh with us? Maybe it's strength, maybe it's a commitment to, what do we want the next chapter to look like? So let's use our last few minutes with an example of what we might build together. So what is it? Maybe you've experienced it. Maybe there's a family member going through it at the moment. There's an IVF one, retirement, mourning, surviving the loss of a beloved, which I love because we've got loads of examples. I think we do a brilliant we do brilliantly in Judaism around bereavement, and death and dying is definitely my example of the rabbis of old were the best psychologists. But what does it mean to continue that process of being able to look back and say, I have coped with this, I've survived? Let's take the moment that someone starts IVF, because it was a fertility journey that started my obsession with mikveh. What are we moving past? What might we acknowledge in our first immersion that starting an IVF journey is about the chapter that we're closing? What might we be closing in that moment?
Renew your body to make it easier for your body to accept the journey you're going on.
Amazing. So by starting IVF implies that there's been a whole journey before that of infertility, and what does it mean to move past the punishing your body, being cross with your body for it not doing what you want it to do, to be being able to say, I'm moving past the negative relationship that I've had with my body that has not managed to yet carry a child. And maybe it's involved loss at this point as well. Maybe there have been miscarriages that have got to this point. So maybe there's also something about being able to grieve. What does it mean, rather than miscarriages often being so much more about, okay, and now I need to start the next journey, and now I need to try again, being able to take a moment in the mikveh and say, okay, so this is the moment where I have to acknowledge the loss, acknowledge the grief, and be able to move past that. So with that first blessing of the mikveh, that what you would be holding onto at that point is the grief and the punishment of the past, and to be able to say perhaps the blessing for tevilah, the blessing for going into the water and leaving that loss, that anger, that upset, that loss and that bereavement in the water with you. So we've got the acceptance of the second immersion. What are we accepting? What's the present all about? And I think, Alexandra, you really kind of opened that space up as well. That thing of, how do you enable yourself to be open to the hope that this is going to be the positive, the answer? So it gives us the Shechechianu blessing, the blessing of arriving at this moment. So I've left the loss as much as you can and the anxiety of the journey that I've been on behind me. And now I'm saying, here I am. Thank you, God, for bringing me to this moment, the moment of renewal, the moment of hope, where this blessing, this immersion in water opens me up to the possibility that my doctors might be the answer, that this process might be the answer to bringing a new life into the world. And may this first round of IVF be the one that enables me to hold a pregnancy. And then we allow ourselves that little brief time to look to the future, to be able to dream and to be able to hope of what that third immersion might look like, is really that opportunity to be able to say, may I be able to come in my 9th month of pregnancy, which is a traditional time to use the mikveh just before I give birth, that opportunity to come and immerse again, and to be able to give thanks for the miracle that I be holding within me, and to be able to leave again the sadness and the challenges of the journey. And so we immerse out of the water with those droplets of water still on our skin that kind of represent that hope, that future that we are hoping to bring with us into that new chapter. What Rabbi Anna was talking about, of that trying to be creative within a communal setting and within the boundaries that our Judaism gives us, is also about saying, what does it mean in our lives to make sure our Judaism's talking to the very moments that we're in at that point, and not just going, well, I'll just make something up, but being able to say, how can my Judaism of old speak to these moments, even if these moments feel very modern and new. And just to respond to the question in the chat, which is, mikveh has always been, even from biblical times, something that men used as well to go from one state of being into another. But for some reason, it evolved into being all about periods and menstruation, and men stopped talking about mikveh. But part of that is it is about being able to not just bring back mikveh into our progressive world and ethos, but also for everybody, and for the moments that perhaps we don't yet have enough ritual for.